Today we are going to talk about the Indian Land Force. India is a country which shares its borders with 7 countries, among them 2 external powers which pose a threat taken seriously by the government. China first of all, against which India has already fought in 1962 and which currently is more and more on the offensive to assert itself as the first world power and a second rival. Pakistan, of course, the eternal brother Muslim enemy of India, with which it had already fought in 1947, in 1965, in 1971. Not to mention the Cardiff conflict in 1999 in the mountainous region of Jammu and Kashmir, where tensions still remain high in this disputed territory. Pakistan and China are naturally close together, which has greatly contributed to modernizing the 600,000 men of the Pakistani army. Let us not forget either that the 3 rivals are also equipped with nuclear weapons, and in this precise context we notice that if the nuclear weapon allows for the moment to avoid open confrontations, it does not, however, exclude reforms and the use of conventional forces, as evidenced by recurrent clashes at the borders. The Indian Army and a legacy of the British Raj Army established by the British colonial administration in the 19th century. Today we are going to be interested in its industry and its equipment, its particularism and also its doctrine. India is in huge territory, a continent all by itself with large borders that must be protected from the outside but also from the interior. So first of all, the Indian Land Force is a 1,362,500 active soldiers in 2019 and around 800,000 reservists, 4,000 tanks, 2,000 armored personnel carriers, 4,300 pieces of artillery and 200 light helicopters, besides Alouettes for the most part, but which are in replacement phase. Well, you understand that having numbers is good. Having quality and numbers is better. One of the first challenges of the Indian Army is its dependence on equipment. This concern is old, since from the beginning of the British administration, then the foundation of the British Raj Army. So here we are in the 19th century. It massively imported standard equipment from the British Empire and at best produced small arms under British license. Today India has 49 arms factories, mainly under the control of the Ordnance Factory Board, a conglomerate of companies that brings together factories of armament mainly intended for light and heavy weapons for the Indian Armed Forces, thereby mainly comprising the manufacture of small caliber ammunition, powder, engines or even artillery pieces as well as their ammunition. And this is to meet the needs of its armed forces that India is a large importer of weapons on a global scale. The second from 2015 to 2019 behind Saudi Arabia, and for a very long time the largest importer in the world. It is a vast market dominated by the giants Russian and American armaments in the lead, but also France and Israel, etc. This despite government initiatives to design and produce locally, in particular by developing more sophisticated technologies. At this state-of-the-art level of development, India is highly dependent on its SMEs, but the COVID-19 crisis risks sweeping over half of the companies in the sector. The infantry is at the heart of the F-INSIS modernization project, which must improve its weaponry, its projection capacity and its means of communication. India has already bought 72,000 American rifles, SIG 716 G2, or R-15 for the regular mass. We also have the Russian AK-203, built under license in India, which should equip 700,000 soldiers. India also brings machine guns, Israeli Negev or UAE Caracal rifles, a version of the HK-416. I am just opening a little parenthesis to tell you that the figures given in this video are a range. So if you have the best sources, do not hesitate to share everything that in comments and to correct the datas. On the side of the armored weapons, the Indian Army has a strong contingent of tanks inherited from the last century, that is to say approximately between 3,000 to 4,000 tanks T-90M and S and T-72 modernized that the Indian Army aligns. India also depends on Russia, which exports part of these models. Nevertheless, the program of the T-90 is also produced under license in India since 2004 by Heavy Vehicle Factory. But the majority of the components must be imported, which actually brings the problem back to a bit of the same. On the mechanized infantry side, India is equipped with about roughly 1,000 modified BMP-2, 125 BNP-2K for command, by design Soviet but made in India by Ordnance Factory Maida K, as well as about 350 to 400 BNP-1. We are therefore on a fleet of armored vehicles for the infantry of about 1,400 pieces to 2,000 pieces, which is enormous but insufficient to fully protect the broad borders of the country. The Indian staff estimates that the needs are 2,600 mechanized infantry vehicles. Of course, you have seen it here. For its armored and mechanized fleet, India depends mainly on Russian know-how and licenses. So we have a modernization program which has emerged and which plans to gradually replace the tanks with, in particular, the Arjun Mk2 model, developed by the Indian government agency responsible for the development of military technology, or the Defense Research and Development Organization, concerning the replacement of BMP's Soviet. Several companies are in the race, but probably the FI-CV of the Indian company Tata is in a good position to win the tender. We will see all this later, and therefore gradually India should turn to local motorization of its armies. Of course, the gigantism of the Indian Army does not stop with these tanks and these armored vehicles. The Indian Army is made up of 190 regiments equipped with rocket system, missiles, cannons, but also drones. Here again, the majority of heavy equipment has come from the USSR since 1968, with M46 artillery pieces initially 130 mm, then improved to 155 mm by the Israeli firm Soltam in 2008. India has also created its own variants, the SP-130 catapult, based on the original Soviet model. The guns, you will understand it, are therefore rustic and not for all that ineffective. India plans to modernize its artillery strength with around 3,000 pieces to be delivered by 2025, and this modernization has already started with the acquisition of American 155 mm M777 howitzers. We also have deliveries of 100 South Korean self-propelled guns K9 Vajra, which is a modified version by the Indian firm Larsen & Toubro Limited, designed especially for the desert. India also has hundreds of BM-30 Smerk, Russian rocket launchers and Russian Indian-designed BrahMos missiles launched from ramps. India is also developing the Dhanush 155 mm cannon, as well as many other increasingly modern artillery projects. In short, as for the armoured branch, India is seeking to reduce its dependence by developing and supporting its military-industrial complex at best, and at worst by diversifying its buyers. India has the advantage of having a dialogue of military cooperation as well with Russia, the United States and South Korea, or France, Israel, etc. It can therefore play competition on the one hand to make the most of the purchase of equipment, and on the other to develop its own technology by drawing inspiration from the best. Since December 31, 2019, the equivalent of the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Manoj Munkan Naravan, leads millions of professional soldiers of the Indian Army. This land army and a standard land army which has the particularity of being completed in its missions by paramilitary units, the Infantrymen of Assam and the Special Frontier Force. The Infantrymen of Assam are composed of approximately 63,000 men. Divided into 46 battalions under the command of the Minister of the Interior is a direct legacy of the time of the British Raj, where the unit was created in 1835 and was intended to protect the colonial territories of the time. It then had a role of military police in the regions sensitive. The Infantrymen of Assam now specialize in counterinsurgency and border security operations or for emergency aid to civilian populations in the event of a disaster. Re-establishing communication lines of education and medical assistance in the most remote areas, it now guards the border with Burma, an area which has been contested between the two countries for centuries. Let's talk about the Special Frontier Force, or their second name the Vikas Battalion. They were formed in 1962 to fight against the Chinese army in Tibet during the Sino-Indian clashes. The unit was formed mainly by Tibetan nationals, refugees in India but also of Gurkhas of Nepal. The unit fought in the Liberation War of Bangladesh in 1971 against Pakistan, as well as the conflict of Kargil, which I quoted in introduction. Always against Pakistan in the region of Jammu-e-Kashmir in 1999. I invite you to learn more about this unit with a very particular history. The idea that germinated in the head of an Indian general in the 1950s. In front of the flow of Tibetan refugees in the context of conflict between the Tibetan resistance and the Chinese army, there was also a visible CIA support in the context of the Cold War and the political involvement of the Dalai Lama, who is somewhat the spiritual leader of the unit. In short, it now consists of less than 10,000 men, divided into 6 battalions, and for connoisseurs who ask the question, the Special Frontier Force served this year 2020. From May to September in the clashes between the Indian and Chinese army in the disputed region of Kashmir, a clash that made several dozen dead and injured. To give you the context, in this mountainous area India and China accuse each other of breaking the border agreements. This real line of control, as it is called, is in fact a demarcation very imprecise over a little over 4,500 kilometers, and we come back once again to Indian gigantism, and you immediately understand why India needs such of forces. We will now approach the last chapter of this video, the organization and the doctrine. India is a continent all by itself. You have understood it. We have already said it. The main external threats are located in borders with China, Pakistan as well as Bangladesh. The Indian Army carries out missions of deterrence, protection as well as police India, and a mosaic of communities with significant inter-community tensions that can cost life to several thousand people and ignite very quickly. On the organization side, there are 6 geographic commands. For the Northwest, the West, the Southwest, the East, the Southeast and the Center. We also have a command dedicated to training, and we have of course the Indian staff. The commands are organized in corps with within them standard infantry divisions, reinforced divisions called mechanized, as well as specialized divisions, such as mountain infantry, artillery divisions, independent brigades, not to mention support or even support as well as armored vehicles. An interesting element compared to France, for example, is the presence of army corps intended solely for defense and others only for the offensive. A specialization allowed of course by its large personnel. For the offensive, the so-called fast infantry divisions stand out. For the reorganized Army Plains Infantry Division created in the 1980s. These groups consist of combat tanks and mechanized infantry based in Punjab and Rajasthan, at the border with Pakistan. Indian doctrine, like any military doctrine, provides for both offensive and defensive actions, of course, depending on the intensity of the conventional conflict. It must also be reiterated that the Indian forces are involved in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism on Indian soil. India is also working to equip itself with a rapid reaction force, including here mainly rapid intervention with small groups of airborne special forces. In conclusion of this video, we would still have a lot to say about India, but all this is still only a synthesis. We don't hear much about the Indian Army. However, it is one of the most important in the world, which is opposed in a fight of giants, in particular against China, in a logic of alliance of setback. China, it is allied with the Pakistan to support it militarily, while India is looking both to the west but also to Russia and South Korea to compensate for the low capacity of its military-industrial complex, which is in the process of development. The great challenge of the Indian Army, it is the Herculean task to modernize its army in its entirety. The infantryman sorely lacks ballistic protection, modern individual armament. So of course it must be done as quickly as possible, which encourages and import weapons, but while developing the military-industrial complex as well in terms of advanced technology as small caliber ammunition and equipment. In the current context, India also contributes to UN peacekeeping operations and is one of the largest contributors, with more than 200,000 Indian soldiers having served at the UN over the past 70 years. It is particularly involved also in Africa in a logic of counterbalancing the Chinese influence, and also participates in joint training with the West as well as Russia or Bangladesh at a regional level. Internally, India seeks to optimize its operational agility while optimizing costs. India has been modernizing its army for several years, and it takes time, especially to face of an organized and equally determined Chinese rival. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.